Okay, let's get more heavily into markup, which is another way of saying HTML, and sort of do a little review as we're really heading into HTML now. As you've used it already, now let's just talk about it more specifically, as you certainly should know. HTML is, we have HTML elements. Elements are designated by tags. So we have an opening tag and a closing tag. And then there'll be something in between, and that will be the element, right? Opening tag, closing tag. But on the other hand, you could have an opening element and a closing element. Or you could have just a single one, a single tag, an empty one. We call it empty or replacement tag. All right, and in either case, whether it's a double one or a single one, you could have some attributes in here. That would be, we would call it an attribute. There's always followed by an equal sign, always followed by quotation marks, and inside will be a value. In other words, we're making some modification to the element. We're modifying a certain attribute, and we're modifying it by attribute. It's supposed to be two T's, attribute, and we're modifying it with a certain amount, by a certain value. And this idea of having an attribute and a value is something that doesn't matter if it's a normal two-part, two-tag element, or whether it is an empty or replacement one. You can have it either way. And to use examples, of course, more specific examples, as we'll see in just a minute in the actual presentation, you know, H1, oh, that's not right. H1 opens it, and we say big heading, and then we close it, right? So we can have a heading like that, or more likely, we could have paragraphs. We could have inline elements like EMs or strongs in there. We can also do something we'll talk about later called giving something IDs or classes. All right, more about that as we go along. Ways to designate things, certain chunks of or individual pieces of HTML or multiple pieces of HTML together to do something else with, do some styling with, for instance. A typical element that we always see attributes in is an IMG, which you've already used, right? IMG stands for image, but on its own it does nothing because you need the source. And then equal sign and then quotation marks, right? And the source is going to be, if the image is right there, it's just the name of the image. If I had an image called that. But remember, we require it to have alt text. Alt, and then an equal sign, that's always in quotation marks. Remember, attributes always have equal sign, always followed by quotation marks. And then the value goes in there, and this would be description of the image. That would be the text that would go in there. So we have tags. Multiple tags usually go together to make an element. Sometimes it's a single tag, and tags can also have attributes and values. Now let's look at the presentation a little bit for some markup basics. So block elements. Okay, your text just puts elements, and lots of people put elements into two categories: block and inline. All right, you need to know what is a block element. So a block element simply means an element which is set off on its own in a block, like on its own line, like a heading is on its own line, a paragraph is on its own line, right? Inline elements we'll go over in a minute, and you'll see also I add a third category, which your textbook doesn't, but I want you to know for the quizzes and stuff, which I call sectioning or grouping elements. Okay, so what should you know for block elements? You should have read about these already. You've already used a number of these. Headings. We have H1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6. There's 6 headings optionally. Typically, every page will have one H1 and only one H1. you may have multiple H2s and H3s. Think about these as like an indented kind of outline, right? So the overall page topic is the H1. The first subtopic is an H2. Maybe you have another subtopic then, which is another H2, another subtopic which is an H2, but maybe one of those H2s has a topic within it, so it's going to be an H3. We often don't go much further than H3. Sometimes we go to H4. It's unusual to get to 5 or 6. Although it is true that these different levels of heading carry some sort of integral formatting, size difference really. The H1 by itself has a certain size. We tend to sort of ignore that and realize we're going to add things like font and size and stuff with CSS later. Then the very most common kind of block element is a paragraph. And we have 3 kinds of lists. We'll get to those in a minute. You'll get to those with your AP style exercise. You're going to use all 3 kinds of lists, and you can read about your 3 kinds of lists, right? An unordered list, a ordered list, so it would be a UL, an OL, and then a definition or description list, a DL. You've already used an HR. An HR, some people call it horizontal rule. The actual name for it is paragraph level thematic break. It's an HR. It is an empty or replacement element, a single one. Remember, headings are, there's open H, close H. Paragraphs, there's open P, close P, right? And HR sits on its own. A couple that we will be using later, or one anyway that we'll be using later, is a block quote. So we won't be using it right away, but know that is yet another example of a block element. We would use that for extensive quotes that you want to stand out separately kind of from the normal part of a story. It's a kind of a journalistic use, a block quote. Inline elements. There are a lot of inline elements. In fact, your textbook has a page that looks something like this with a huge number of inline elements and interesting little backstory on elements, inline elements. Many of them look like formatting. They look kind of like they'd be CSS, you know, like a B. Does that look like it should be bold? And that's where they did come from. But these days, in the modern HTML and CSS, where we separate structure and style, we now talk about them as text level inline elements, yes, but although they may carry something like styling with them, we use them because of the meaning that they carry. So there's a great number of them, but the ones that I want you to know are these. You should know the ABBR. We're going to use that in the AP style exercise, right? It's a way to handle abbreviations. B, it means, the semantic meaning of it is keyword, not bold, keyword. BR is a line break. You've already used those, the BRs, in the bistro exercise and so on. We don't want to overuse them. Just use them when we have something within the same block element that we want to appear on separate lines. EM means as if said with emphasis. I doesn't mean italic. It means as I've said in a different mode, voice or mode. So it might be a piece of jargon, for instance. And then strong means important. It doesn't mean bold, it means important. So what is an inline element? If a block element means things that are in their own block or in their own line, inline elements are things that go with the flow of the block. They are within a block element. They don't go on their own line. They flow within the block. Some others that you should know are small, which is for legalese, such as copyright. Sub for subscript, sup for superscript. By small is a 2-part one. All of these so far are 2-part ones. In fact, except for BR. And WBR is not either. Which is a word break opportunity. I'll demo that for you. You won't be using it right away, or it might be rarely used. There's many others that are listed there which we will not be using. So these are some you should know. Inline elements. Okay, good. Sectioning and grouping elements. Okay. This is a different category. These are things you should know what these are now. You'll be asked on a quiz to name a couple of them, but You won't really be using them right away, and I will probably not give you a demo on them until the end of the week in that more markup area. Divs. A div is the block-like generic grouping element. We could put a div around a whole bunch of stuff on a page, and then we would tell in CSS, we would say to the div, this is how I want you to behave. Span is like an inline generic grouping element. It's just group some words together. These and all elements can be given something called an ID or something called a class. In other words, sometimes we have multiple H2s on a page, but maybe you want one of them to be a different color. How do we tell that H2 to be different from the other H2s? We have to give it a name. We give it an ID. An ID is an attribute. You see the equal sign and you see the quotation marks, and then the value is a word we're going to link to the CSS. Or we give it a class. IDs and classes. Class works the same sort of way. You might add a class to a div or a span or some other element. It's an attribute. So classes are a way to do repeated styling. Let's say we want to use a certain kind of bolding throughout. We don't want to have to, we need some ways to designate that element takes on that character. We would give it a class, repeated classes. So ID is just used once on a page. Class could be used repeatedly. Some other sectioning grouping elements, which are newer ones, are article, figure, and fig caption, aside, header, footer, nav, section. These, again, by themselves don't do anything necessarily, but you put them around an area and it kind of like names it. This is the navigation area. This is the header area. This is the footer area. And then you might do something to it. You might give it an attribute. And then it would, or you might use that in the CSS. So that's sectioning and grouping. So that's by 3 kinds of elements. And then we have special or escape characters, and you're going to be using these, one of these at least, in the your AP style exercise. What it really comes down to is, and by the way, there's a long list of special escape characters from your text, including non-breaking space, which is a useful one, which I'll use in a little demo towards the end of the week. And you'll see most of them are pretty much the same list that I have here. You'll notice that they're described, they say what they are, then there's a name and a number. You can use them either way. You can use the name and they appear, or you can use the number and they appear. Most people remember the names because they're easier to remember. So there are more here than you need to know. These are the ones that I think you need to know. So here's what these are about. You know that HTML is interpreted, and special characters that are within it could sometimes be interpreted as code. Special characters that are in the text could be interpreted as code as opposed to something you really want to type. What if you want to use a more than or less than symbol? Well, normally more than less than symbols are used as the chevrons that designate a tag. But what if you really want one to appear? You have to have a way to type it. And then other special characters too, like copyright, for instance, or long dashes, which is an M dash. All right. So we have these. What's been developed is these long lists of these ways to make special characters appear, like the ampersand. You actually type an ampersand. In fact, in all these cases, they start with an ampersand and they end with a semicolon. And what's within them makes that special character appear. One special character to know also is a non-breaking space, which is NBSP, which this is probably how you remember it as opposed to the number. The number ones all use hashtags, but they're the same thing. You don't have to know the number in the name. You just have to know one or the other, and you probably will learn the word one as opposed to the number one. These are a way to make special characters appear in the text for the person looking at the website, as opposed to them being mistaken for some code or something that would screw up your page. Okay, so that's a rundown of some basics about markup as we're getting going into marking up structure of a document.